If you're someone grappling with decolonial theory, maybe feeling stuck moving past critique towards genuine pathways of action, well, today's deep dive is definitely for you. We're not just analyzing systems of oppression today, we're exploring a really radical indigenous-led blueprint for freedom. And it starts somewhere maybe unexpected with a spiritual revolution. Yeah, we're plunging into some profound Ankwe Hanwe, that's the original people philosophy. We're drawing on source material that honestly challenges the very foundation of how we usually think about liberation. This text it doesn't really offer negotiation in the usual sense. It's more about rejection and recreation.
That's absolutely right. The sources we've synthesized here, they give us this really intensive look at a political and ethical vision called Wasáse. And for our listeners, especially maybe students engaging with Native studies or, anti-colonial thought generally, this concept is just crucial, Wasáse. It's defined in these sources not as some kind of political manifesto, but as a ceremony of collective unity, strength, and really an unwavering commitment to action.
Ceremony of action.
Yeah. And our mission today is to really try and understand this path because the core argument is kind of startling. It says any truly regenerative struggle has to prioritize spiritual revolution and profound personal transformation. And that has to come before any external political or economic gains can be, sustainably achieved. If you start with the money or the law,
Yeah.
the fight's kind of over before it even begins.
Okay, wow. Let's unpack that right away because that's a central and frankly radical assertion. It completely flips the script on, well, most conventional liberation movements, doesn't it? They usually prioritize political control or maybe economic redistribution first.
Totally flips it, yeah.
So the core idea here is that meaningful decolonization needs this complete rejection of colonial logic, its institutions, and that rejection has to happen first inside the individual mind and spirit.
Precisely. Exactly. If that internal foundation is compromised, if the individual's mind is still sort of structured by materialist greed or colonial definitions of what power even is, then any negotiated outcome, doesn't matter if it's a land claim victory or some self-government agreement, it's just fundamentally destined to embed new bureaucracies within that same colonial framework. It becomes like an act of self-entrapment.
Right, you trap yourself using the master's tools, essentially.
You could put it that way, yeah.
Okay, so to really grasp why this internal revolution is deemed so necessary, we have to go right back to basics, like the definition of reality itself. Tell us about the indigenous paradigm that this Onkwehonwe worldview springs from, because you're saying it's fundamentally at odds with Western materialism.
Oh, it's a world away.
Yeah.
Truly. The core tenets you find of the Native American paradigm described here. They're built on ideas like reality being in constant flux, constant motion. There's no such thing as inert matter. All of creation is seen as consisting of vibrating energy waves. Everything is animate, it's imbued with spirit, and critically, everything is dynamically interrelated. It's a universe of continuous flow and relationship, not a collection of fixed, separate, measurable objects.
This idea of constant flux, that's where it gets really interesting, I think, especially for those of us, maybe steeped in more stable scientific models. If reality is just constantly flowing energy, then its continued existence isn't guaranteed, is it?
Yeah.
It needs to be actively maintained.
Exactly right. There's this deep sort of tacit assumption underpinning things that continued existence relies on a very specific harmonious combination of those energy waves. And if that combination dissolves or it falls out of balance, reality doesn't just change. The sources suggest it actually disappears back into the undifferentiated flux.
Yeah.
This isn't just abstract philosophy. It's framed as practical reality maintenance.
Practical reality maintenance. Wow. So if reality is this precarious kinetic system, it demands constant effort. That must be the driver behind the really pervasive nature of renewal ceremonies we see in many indigenous cultures.
That's it, precisely.
They aren't just cultural traditions for show, they're vital, essential work.
Absolutely essential work, yes. The numerous renewal ceremonies described, the songs that have to be sung and resung in the appropriate season, the stories told and retold, the traditional seasonal rounds of activity. These are all efforts aimed squarely at maintaining that cosmological harmony and balance. You could almost see them as the indigenous method of, engineering stability in a world defined by flux.
Engineering stability, I like that. And this leads then to a really foundational difference in how time and space are understood. If Western thought is often primarily linear, temporal, focusing on a sequence of events, history as a timeline, this indigenous paradigm seems to view reality and history with space as the primary referent. Why is space so crucial here?
Well, because certain events, certain patterns, cycles, happenings,
Hmm.
they only occur at certain places. Space isn't just, geographic coordinates on a map. It's encoded with spiritual data, historical data. The identity of the people becomes inseparable from the land because the land itself dictates the cycles of renewal and the necessary ways to engage with creation. This makes the territory inherently sacred, active, really central to political identity, which is, of course, in stark contrast to the colonial view of land as just disposable, measurable, something to be bought and sold, a commodity.
Okay, so if that's the native paradigm, interdependent, animated, constantly needing renewal, how did the sources characterize the colonial mindset, specifically the British colonizers, when these two worldviews collided?
Well, the sources offer a very, very harsh analysis, actually. They describe the British as accultural, but specifically in an indigenous sense. And that's not meant as just a superficial insult. It's presented as a critique rooted in the history of successive conquests and takeovers in Britain itself that systematically erased any semblance of their own indigeneity to their homeland. So the argument is they arrived effectively disconnected from a deep spiritualized connection to their own place.
That's a really fascinating perspective. A people sort of unmoored from their own place of origin, carrying a kind of cultural vacuum.
Yeah.
What did this absence, this emptiness, translate into ideologically when they encountered North America?
According to these sources, it translated into an intense, almost unregulated focus on the individual and the unrestrained pursuit of individual material gain. This is often linked historically to the Calvinist school of thought, but the underlying idea is if you lack the grounding of an integrated place-based culture, the only guiding principle left is really self-interest and accumulation. This unrestrained individualism then formed the ideological basis for their colonial actions. They were essentially replacing spiritual value with material utility.
And when this individualized acquisitive culture then tried to force assimilation onto native communities, the result wasn't really transformation, but what the source dramatically calls cultural pollution.
That sounds...
Yeah, like an environmental disaster for the soul.
It is, in effect, yeah. This collision created what the sources term cultural blanks. These are individuals who've been systematically stripped of their indigenous cultural code, but they often can't fully or successfully assimilate the colonizer's code either. So they become trapped in this kind of normative void, lacking a coherent set of values or norms to guide their behavior. And this absence of grounding, that is the definition of the spiritual crisis that Wasáse aims to resolve.
Right. So if the colonizers' perceived emptiness created this cultural void, what's the mechanism by which the Onkweonwe actively fill that void? How do they create cultural cohesion from their perspective? We're talking about the spiritual foundation now, maybe exemplified by something like the Thanksgiving address.
Yes, exactly. The Ohenten Kariwatikwen, often translated as the words that come before all else. And it isn't just a prayer in the simple sense. It's a profound acknowledgement of all the elements of creation that sustain life. It establishes the fundamental context, the baseline reality for all subsequent political, social, and spiritual thought.
Can you walk us through the political weight of acknowledging these elements? Because it feels like it's more than just saying thank you.
Right. Oh, far more. Think about the components that are thanked, acknowledged. The trees, first. They're recognized explicitly as symbols of peace, strength, reverence. They ground us physically. Then the birds, whose songs are seen as a constant reminder to appreciate life. The four winds, which regulate the climate. And then, critically, the two celestial beings. The sun, referred to as the eldest brother, the source of all life, and the moon, the oldest grandmother, who lights the night sky, governs the tides, and embodies the strength and wisdom inside women.
That relational hierarchy, using family terms like brother and grandmother for the sun and moon, that must fundamentally shape one's view of power and place in the universe.
It absolutely does. It places humans squarely within a family of interdependent beings, not perched to the top of some hierarchy built for domination. And the entire address, it culminates in that powerful declaration, now our minds are one. This unity of mind, this conscious collective connection to creation is the absolute baseline. From this perspective, if your mind isn't one with the sustaining cosmos, then your political platform, your social plan, it's considered fundamentally illegitimate or at least structurally flawed right from the start.
Okay, so this foundational spiritual alignment leads directly into what sounds like a profound critique of, well, standard native nationalist movements, maybe even some decolonial movements. If the goal is this internal unity, this one mind, why are the conventional political paths, things like land claims, self-government negotiations, pushing for legal rights, why are these seen as ultimately failing in the source material?
Yeah, the source material is pretty ruthless in its assessment here. It argues that these kinds of statist solutions, even when they seem to achieve crucial goals like legal recognition or, economic development funding,
Yeah.
they have ultimately failed to meaningfully improve the happiness or the health of all but a very, very small minority of Indigenous people involved.
That's a really harsh critique. I mean, for many communities, surely things like land claims agreements or moves towards self-government provide immediate practical necessities: better housing, healthcare access, education funding. How does the source balance that practical need with this idea of spiritual purity?
It acknowledges the absolute necessity of survival, of course, but it critiques the mechanism of compromise used to achieve it. The failure, according to these sources, is really twofold. First, these agreements often just create new bureaucracies that are simply modeled on colonial, often corporate structures. You end up replicating the system. And second, maybe most importantly, the focus on political power and money is seen as completely irrelevant to the root problem, which is defined as this spiritual crisis, the profound disconnection from land and harmonious culture. So seeking large-scale, statist, material solutions for what is fundamentally framed as a spiritual problem, it's seen as a category error, using the wrong tools.
So the source is suggesting that the mere pursuit of state-recognized self-government, even if you win it, just hands you the keys to a newly painted colonial administrative office. You're still inside the same building.
Precisely. That's a good way to put it. You're still operating within the ontological, the political framework of the very state you're supposedly trying to escape. And this is why the concept of Aboriginalism is introduced. It's framed as a really dangerous assimilative identity.
Okay, define Aboriginalism for us then, as the source uses it. Because it sounds like a necessary, though maybe provocative, concept for students of decolonial thought to really grapple with.
Right, so Aboriginalism is defined here as the ideology and identity of assimilation. It's presented as a legal and social construction of the state, maintained and disciplined through things like racialized violence and, crucially, legislative definitions of who counts as Aboriginal. The argument is, when Onkwoyanwe individuals accept this state-defined Aboriginal label and identity, they become bound within a logic of outright assimilation. They often end up abandoning any meaningful or sovereign notion of being truly Indigenous. Essentially, they become defined by the state, not by their connection to creation or their own traditions.
And the very language used within this framework reinforces the trap. I mean, words that sound positive on the surface, like recovery, reconciliation, resolution. These are characterized here as false representations of the heritage of Indigenous struggle.
Exactly. They're seen as false because they implicitly, or sometimes explicitly, demand surrender. Reconciliation, for instance, in this critique, implies that Indigenous people must find a way to become comfortable and functional within the existing colonial state structure. It means abandoning any real concept of true sovereignty or separation. The language itself demands that the Onkwoyanwe surrender their sovereign, true selves to become fundamentally just another category of citizen within the system they're meant to be fighting against.
Yeah.
It's framed as a vocabulary of capitulation.
Wow. Okay. This then leads into the incredibly difficult discussion around corruption and co-optation, particularly in leadership roles. If the state is offering potentially massive financial incentives or political status, what does the source say about the integrity of Indigenous leaders who accept those terms?
It really doesn't pull any punches on this. The text highlights how the immense fear of genuine change, which is understandable, compounded sometimes by personal issues like abuse or addiction stemming from colonial trauma, combined with huge financial incentives, how this can lead leaders, political figures, economic elites, even some moderate intellectuals to actively, if sometimes subtly, conspire with colonial authorities. They choose the path of, well, comfort and money over perceived principle.
And the source uses the Vancouver Olympic bid anecdote to illustrate this quite starkly, doesn't it? Showing this abandonment of ancestral rights for what looks like capitalist gain.
It's presented as a really devastating example, yes. The source recalls a specific chief justifying his council's decision to participate in what was essentially a massive real estate and tourist bonanza, prioritizing development dollars and profits.
Yeah.
And his rationale, as quoted, was striking. He apparently called it the path of least resistance and just going with the flow.
Going with the flow, when the flow is colonialism itself, that's chilling.
It's seen as the ultimate failure of the Wasáse imperative. The source views this focus on money and power, what it bluntly calls the Indian industry, as the active defeat of the struggle. No less destructive, it argues, than the residential schools were for previous generations. The pursuit of capitalist gain, even if done in the name of the community, ends up destroying the very spiritual and cultural foundation that the struggle is supposedly meant to protect. It replaces the warrior's dedication with a kind of crass pragmatism.
Okay, so if the conventional legal and materialist paths are defined as this kind of colonial trap, then the only alternative presented is this radical spiritual path. Wasáse, how does this define revolution differently?
Well, Wasáse is defined first and foremost as a spiritual revolution. At its absolute core, it aims to transform society by recreating existences and regenerating cultures from the inside out. It's not really about taking political power from the settler state in the conventional sense. It's more about surging with collective spiritual strength against the binding colonial forces that constrain people.
And why is it so insistent that other kinds of revolutions, materialist ones, violent ones, even purely legalist ones, have fundamentally failed pretty much everywhere they've been tried?
The argument is that they focus only on the mechanism of power, not the underlying philosophy or spirit. So, failed revolutions, whether they're communist or anti-colonial nationalisms or purely economic upheavals, often fail to produce genuinely peaceful coexistence. Or they fail to create conditions that are fundamentally different from what they opposed. They just end up, as the source puts it, mimicking foreign logics. You swap one oppressive administrative class for another, often just as bad or worse. Essentially, if you use the colonizer's tools, violence, state bureaucracy, purely materialist goals to gain power, you inevitably become a reflection of that colonizer.
That's such a crucial point for anyone studying statecraft or liberation, isn't it? This idea of means-ends consistency. If you want peace, you have to practice peace. If you want spiritual freedom, you have to start with spiritual discipline.
Exactly. Which leads directly to the imperative of what this source calls nonviolent militancy. Wasáse is not about passive acceptance. It's conceived as an active, rigorous struggle. It's defined quite specifically as morally grounded defiance and nonviolent agitation combined with the development of a collective capacity for self-defense. So it's a fierce but disciplined pushback.
Why is that capacity for self-defense considered so vital if the primary strategy is nonviolent? Is it purely for deterrence, or is there something else going on there?
Well, it's framed as multidimensional. Militarily, there's a recognition they cannot win a conventional war against the modern state. It's impossible. So the strategic goal of this militant nonviolence is primarily political. It's about generating incentive within the broader settler society to actually negotiate constructively. But based on a recognition of indigenous strength and sovereignty, not out of pity or some abstract legal obligation. Because if the state gets to define peace strictly as maintaining its own order and the rule of its law, then the struggle is already defeated, right? Because that definition inherently assumes colonial supremacy.
Right. So peace itself needs to be reconceptualized. It's not just the absence of conflict on the state's terms.
Absolutely. Peace in this framework is redefined as the active state of being en Guanwe, asserting regenerated identities, living according to those principles, alongside the consistent rejection of state oppression. And struggle, what the source calls contention, is viewed not as some kind of failure of politics, but as a necessary, justified, and even sincere response to injustice.
That's where that interesting philosophical reference comes in. The source mentions the I Ching, the ancient Chinese text, stating, "In contention there is sincerity." What does bringing in the I Ching add to this concept of militant defiance?
It really elevates the act of struggle beyond just, mere disagreement or protest. It suggests that genuine contention arises from an unwavering commitment to truth. The disagreement itself, the willingness to contend, becomes proof of the sincerity of your belief in the necessity of change. You're not fighting for trivial reasons or personal gain. You're fighting because the truth, in this case, the spiritual mandate of the Kainarakoa, the great law of peace, demands that you challenge oppression. It's about redirecting the negative force of that internalized colonial conflict outwards towards its actual source, state injustice.
This implies a fundamentally different ethical focus, too. Most listeners, I imagine, are more familiar with Western, maybe Judeo-Christian ethics, which often focus heavily on the act itself, that thou shalt not kill. How does the indigenous philosophical perspective described here shift that moral lens?
It shifts it quite dramatically, actually. It aligns more perhaps with certain non-Western traditions, like some schools of Buddhism, by focusing much more on context and motivation. The crucial ethical process isn't just judging the act, but trying to figure out why the act was done. What was the underlying motivation? What was the commitment behind it? That determines its moral quality. So an action undertaken for the survival and well-being of the collective, driven by altruism, holds a completely different ethical value than the exact same physical act driven by selfishness or greed or hatred.
Which means that something like raw anger, which often fuels activist movements, isn't seen as inherently negative in this context.
Not if it's channeled and disciplined, no. Anger against settler society's actions or against injustice itself can be seen as a positive, even altruistic force driving necessary action. But, and this is key, it must be restrained and channeled through deliberate self-discipline. This is the core work of nonviolent militancy, maintaining that firmness, that clarity of purpose in the face of fear, provocation, maybe even violence, without letting base negative emotions take control of the collective struggle.
Strategically, then, why is nonviolent resistance seen as the most effective way to actually undermine state power, according to this source?
Because the state's most crucial form of power, ultimately, isn't its military might, but its perceived legitimacy. Its control over the narrative, over community life, over people's minds. The goal of militant non-cooperation is precisely to deny rulers that control and systematically undermine the state's legitimacy by forcing it to operate outside of its own claimed moral parameters. You see, the state's ability to enforce its rules relies heavily on people's passive cooperation, their psychological acceptance of its authority. When that cooperation is withdrawn through mass disciplined action, the state's vulnerability, its dependency on that legitimacy, is exposed.
Okay, so this Wasáse philosophy clearly demands a new kind of individual commitment, which necessitates redefining the very term warrior. We have to move past that typical European, often male-gendered, soldierly image, right? What is the authentic Ankwe concept of the warrior as presented here?
Yes, that's crucial. The authentic concept is profoundly spiritual and protective. It reflects the deepest values of the Kainarakoa, the Great Law of Peace. For instance, the source gives some beautiful Kanian Kahaka, Mohawk concepts. One term used is Rotiskan Hokedi, and that's translated roughly as they carry the burden of peace.
Wow. They carry the burden of peace. That's such a powerful contrast, isn't it? The warrior isn't someone who seeks violence, but someone who takes on the burden of maintaining peace.
Exactly. It reframes the entire role. And another key term mentioned is Oyenko Onto, which is sometimes translated as the tobacco hanging, referring to spiritual protectors within the community.
Yeah.
So the modern warrior, in this view, must draw on this old spirit, this protective spirit, but they're committed in the very first instance to self-transformation. They are fighting essentially a defensive war against the insidious, internalized forms of colonial control and definition.
So the first field of battle is the self.
Yeah, that aligns perfectly with that initial assertion we discussed that self-determination has to begin internally. It absolutely does. Individuals need to systematically reject colonial control, colonial authority, and crucially, colonial definitions of what is even worthwhile in life. Remember, the root of unhappy lives, as established earlier, is seen as this spiritual crisis, this disconnection, fear, and pain. So the fight for personal transformation is framed almost as a hero's journey back to dignity, rejecting that cultural blank status imposed by colonialism.
And the source includes a really moving, specific anecdote that illustrates how this profound spiritual rerouting can actually happen in practice, often completely outside of any institutional framework. Can you tell us about Sakwasup, Art Thompson?
Yes, it's a very powerful story. Sakwasup was a Nuu-chah-nulth artist. He was a survivor of the residential school system who had subsequently fallen deep into addiction, drug use. A really stark example, perhaps, of that cultural blank, suffering profound disconnection. And he was, as the source recounts it, quite literally, physically brought back to life by his 83-year-old grandmother.
How did she manage that? What did she do to facilitate the spiritual regeneration?
Well, significantly, it wasn't through political negotiation or therapy in the Western sense. It was through direct cultural application. She physically took him, repeatedly, for ceremonial bathing in the cold ocean water, a practice known as usums. And she performed what the source describes as the crucial act of restoring his memory ahapta. She did this by constantly speaking to him about his ancestors, specifically about his great-grandfather, who was a renowned whaler. She reconnected him through ancestral memory, through story, and through physical ceremony, back to his identity, his lineage, his place in the world.
That combination, strong family support, traditional teachings, physical mentoring ceremony, that's presented as the Indigenous method of rerouting a person, isn't it? What was the ultimate lesson she imparted to him about his new role, his path forward?
After helping him regain his health and spirit, she told him that since he possessed a talent, he was good with his hands. His duty now was to use that talent for his people. She said, according to the account, that being an artist, creating good things with his hands for the nation, was being the best warrior that you could ever be. So the warrior role is completely redefined. It's not about conquest or fighting in the literal sense, but about the dedication to sustaining and actively regenerating the culture.
But this path, this kind of fierce self-determination rooted in tradition, it must meet significant resistance, mustn't it? Not just from the settler state, but probably from within the community itself, from those who perhaps have accepted that Aboriginalist identity.
That's described as one of the deep tragedies of internalized colonialism, yes. Those Aboriginalist individuals, the ones who have perhaps found a way to cooperate with or benefit from the state system, often exhibit a deep fear of genuine radical change. The source suggests they often lash out with ignorance, hostility, jealousy, sometimes even aggression toward those who are trying to pursue this authentic warrior ethic of self-determination and cultural regeneration. They fear the consequences of upsetting the status quo, of losing whatever compromised status they might hold.
And a major factor in cultural grounding is always language. Now, while declining fluency is an undeniable reality in many communities, the source argues that Ankwahanwe languages are more than just communication tools. They're crucial carriers of specific insights, right? Non-imperial ways of seeing the world.
Yes, they're seen as much more than just vocabulary or grammar. They're described almost as objects in themselves, crucial tools that encode the philosophical wisdom, the relational worldview necessary for existence within that paradigm. The decline in speakers is acknowledged as a serious fact, of course. But the goal isn't just linguistic proficiency for its own sake. It's the regeneration of a whole culture of indigenous knowledge on Reneha, which the language carries. The language contains the relational context, the worldview, that English often struggles or fails to convey.
And finally, in this section on personal transformation, what's the core spiritual principle that underpins this entire drive for a good life, for collective action, for becoming that new kind of warrior?
The source highlights the concept of Kanarankwa. Now, this is usually translated into English simply as love, but the source argues that in Kaninkeha, it carries a much deeper meaning, closer to a profound passion. It's said to reflect Sky Woman's energy in the creation story, her female, insurmountable, redemptive desire to help humanity flourish. So this passionate, selfless commitment to the survival and well-being of the collective, that's framed as the core spiritual power needed for the struggle. It links that individual transformation directly to a cosmological duty.
Okay, so if the individual warrior is internally transformed through this process of Wasáse, they must then engage externally using these disciplined strategies we've touched on. But now we confront maybe the most significant philosophical tension raised in the sources, this really controversial path of pursuing economic power.
Yes, this is definitely where the abstract theory hits the often messy reality of contemporary indigenous politics. The source brings up the prominent example of Ray Halberter and the Oneida Nation's highly successful gaming enterprises in New York. Halberter argues, quite explicitly and forcefully, that economic power is the absolute basis for political power in the modern world. He sees it as necessary for achieving genuine self-sufficiency, for ensuring the future of the seventh generation, and breaking free from dependency on the state. He frames it as a modern necessity for survival and sovereignty.
I mean, on one level, that sounds like straightforward pragmatism, doesn't it? If the state uses money as a primary tool of control, shouldn't indigenous nations acquire that same tool to liberate themselves? Couldn't that be seen as a courageous reinterpretation of warriorism for modern times, fighting with fiscal strength instead of physical force?
It certainly appears effective on the surface, no doubt. It offers rapid, tangible benefits, jobs, services, infrastructure. But the source forces us to ask a critical question. Is this pragmatic efficacy worth the potential cost of separating fundamental principles from those deep Ankwahanwe philosophical roots? When you create a massive, capitalist, consumer-driven enterprise like a casino, even if the profits are intended to benefit the community, you inevitably have to adopt the management structures, the legal strategies, the labor relations models of the colonial state and corporate world.
Ah, so the risk is that the very structure you build to fund liberation ends up spiritually compromising or maybe even assimilating the culture it was meant to save. You become the thing you were fighting.
Precisely. That's the core tension highlighted. Can one truly possess massive economic power, operating through complex corporate structures that inherently prioritize material gain and competition, and still maintain cultural and spiritual authenticity rooted in interdependence, reciprocity, and humility?
Yeah.
The debate remains wide open. Halberter clearly sees dependency on the state as the true defeat. Others, critiqued in the source, might see dependency on colonial economics as an equally destructive, if perhaps more insidious, form of defeat. How do you have both economic power and cultural authenticity? It's a huge question.
Right. So regardless of the economic base chosen, the sources mandate the strategy of militant non-cooperation. Can you detail the practical application of this a bit more? What does it look like on the ground?
Fundamentally, it's about active, strategic non-involvement in the systems of oppression. It means systematic non-cooperation with injustice. It means non-participation in colonial institutions, whether they're legal, administrative, or political, wherever possible and strategic. And it means the deliberate disruption of oppressive systems through disciplined militant nonviolence, things like organized civil disobedience, targeted boycotts, sit-ins, land occupations, and other forms of direct action that challenge the state's control and legitimacy.
And this contention, this disruption, it's designed to force a kind of social and political crisis. You mentioned it hits the settler state on two crucial fronts simultaneously.
Yes, that's the strategic aim. The first front is moral. It aims to create a stark, visible disconnect between the settler society's own professed moral claims, being peaceful, democratic, just, and the state's inevitable response to indigenous assertion, which is often the use of explicit force or violence. When the state sends heavily armed police or military forces to suppress peaceful prayer or ceremony or land defense, the lie of its claimed moral supremacy is exposed, ideally to its own citizens and the international community.
Okay. Exposing the moral hypocrisy. And the second front attacks the state's functional capacity.
Exactly. It aims to create a crucial disjuncture between the state's seemingly overwhelming military and policing capacity and its actual inability to effectively confront widespread, coordinated indigenous collective action using those tools. Think about it. If hundreds or thousands of people engage in disciplined nonviolent resistance simultaneously, perhaps across different regions, the state simply cannot arrest, prosecute, or jail them all without potentially collapsing its own judicial and penal systems. And, crucially, without revealing its true underlying colonial authoritarian nature, it forces the state to show its coercive hand in a way that undermines its legitimacy.
So what's the long-term vision here? It sounds like it's not about driving the settlers out necessarily or achieving military victory, but about fundamentally changing the terms of engagement.
That's right. The ultimate goal described isn't military conquest, which is acknowledged as futile against a modern state. The goal is achieving a condition of deterrence. If ongoing colonial domination becomes too difficult, too costly politically, economically, morally for the state to continue imposing, then this creates the necessary physical and political space for Ankwahanwe people to pursue their own ways of life autonomously according to their own principles. It's essentially about making oppression too expensive, too inconvenient for the state to maintain.
So success within this specific Wasáse framework isn't defined by signing a new treaty or getting a massive financial settlement from the government.
Absolutely not. Success is seen much more dynamically. It's seen when aggressive, assertive, nonviolent actions successfully repel state repression, when they make it clear that the state is simply incapable of eliminating Ankwahanwe freedom of action, whether in political, strategic, or tactical terms. Success is when the state is forced, through sustained pressure, to learn to respect the existence of an autonomous, spiritually grounded political reality that it cannot simply dissolve or assimilate. #outro. So to try and synthesize the core argument for our listeners, especially those really engaged in decolonial thought and practice, this perspective argues that meaningful resurgence must begin with spiritual transformation, with Wasáse as the absolute indispensable foundation. Conventional legalist or materialist solutions are seen to fail because they fundamentally misdiagnose the problem. They try to treat a deep spiritual disconnection as if it were merely an economic or administrative issue. And the strategic path forward advocated here involves this discipline, militant nonviolence, and contention, aimed squarely at attacking the state's most crucial resource, its perceived legitimacy.
Yeah, this deep dive into Ankwahanwe philosophy, it really offers you, the listener, more than just academic knowledge, doesn't it? It presents a radically alternative worldview, one rooted in values like interdependence, humility, responsibility, and this profound ethic of courage. You're really challenged, I think, to apply these concepts. If the fight against colonialism is truly an internal spiritual revolution first, as these sources argue, then maybe the failures of many past native nationalist or traditionalist movements stemmed from becoming framed solely in ideological and political terms. Maybe they ignored the sustaining communal and cultural aspects that actually fuel long-term resistance.
That's certainly a key implication drawn in the material, what actually sustains people through struggle.
Right. We need to focus on what sustains us. So if true liberation, as defined here, demands that you break your artificial attachments to colonial myths, to state-imposed definitions, then maybe the final question for you to consider is this. What is the most comforting lie you have accepted about your own identity, perhaps, or about the nature of power or the path to change that you might now need to confront and reject? We'll leave you with that question to mull over.